Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third installment of A Dangerous Summer with the Hemingway Society webinar series. This topic today is on Hemingway and race. And before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of a few ground rules. By the way, I'm Suzanne Del Gizzo. I'm editor of the Hemingway Review, and I'm also the chair of the Hemingway Society Media Committee. So today we're in a webinar, which means that we cannot see you, but you can see us. We also can't hear you. You have two ways you can communicate with us. The first is a chat, and in the chat function, you can talk to each other. It's designed to say hello, make comments on what's being said on the panel. And then there's also the second option is the Q&A. We ask that you use the Q&A to communicate questions you'd like our panelists to tackle. So that, and also one other thing to tell you, the webinar is being recorded, so we can post it for our friends who can't be here in person today. And I think with all that out of the way, I would just want to say thank you to everybody who's been coming to the other installments of the webinar series. We have one left next week. But today's session is a departure. The previous two meetings have focused on teaching texts. And today we're into a question of race and identity and the way that Hemingway deals with those issues in his work. And, recognizing that this is a challenging moment for these kinds of conversations, which is why we wanted to welcome them and embrace them in our space. But that said, we ask that everybody keep in mind that we are one big, loving, diverse family. And so just keep that in mind when you are commenting in the chat and in your questions. So without any further ado, I am pleased to introduce Carl Eby, the Hemingway Society president.
Welcome, and thanks, Suzanne. Welcome to everyone. Welcome back, as the case may be, to the Hemingway Society's Dangerous Summer webinar series. Today's event is the third of 4 webinars, as Suzanne just mentioned. So in the past couple of weeks, we've just tackled The Sun Also Rises and tackled teaching the short stories. And those have been recorded. They're available at our website. And of course, this session will be on our website as well as next week's session, which is devoted to Hemingway and sex in the time of Me Too. For today's session, we'll be talking about Hemingway and race in the time of Black Lives Matter. Of course, the history of racial injustice in the United States is only too long. And the history of movements for racial justice is almost as long. But after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and too many others, and after the rise of Black Lives Matter, the past few years have been a particularly galvanizing moment for rethinking questions of racism, white supremacy, anti-racist strategies of resistance. And this really has inspired us to think about, well, how might we approach Hemingway in light of this moment? Of course, people have been writing a good deal about Hemingway and race for the past 2 decades, but how does this moment change the way we teach and think about Hemingway and his work? Once again, before we get started, I want to thank Suzanne and the media committee. That would include also Kirk Kernet and Cecil Ponder and Lisa Tyler, Tom Bevilacqua, and Michael Von Cannon for putting this whole webinar series together and bringing us together to have these conversations, particularly in a year when we couldn't be having our conference. And of course, I don't want to miss the opportunity to plug our conference next year in Wyoming and Montana. I hope you all can make it. It'll be wonderful to be back together in person. But these webinars have been a great way of staying together and pursuing our interests together throughout the pandemic, and it's going to be something we're going to continue to do. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Mark Dudley. Mark is a professor of English and Africana Studies at North Carolina State University with specializations in 20th century American and African American literatures. He's published and spoken widely on such authors as Ernest Hemingway, Charles Chestnut, Scott Fitzgerald, and James Baldwin. And he's the author of Hemingway, Race and Art, Bloodlines and the Color Line from Kent State University Press. And most recently, and congratulations on this, Mark, Understanding James Baldwin from the University of South Carolina Press. So now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Mark Dudley. Over to you, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Thanks to Carl. Thanks to Suzanne. Thanks to everybody at the Hemingway Society. And thank you to the panelists for engaging today and making this possible this afternoon. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to add just a couple of more words to add some more context to what Carl just suggested about the purpose of this panel. This panel came about partly as a result of a lot of conversations between members of the Hemingway Society, particularly between conversations between Suzanne and myself over the last couple of months, and trying to contextualize what was happening in this moment and trying to figure out how Hemingway fits into that matrix, especially in light of the mega documentary released by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick a couple of months ago. As comprehensive as that documentary is, and if anybody hasn't seen it yet, it is several hours long, and I would invite you to take a look at it. It's worth the watch, definitely. But as comprehensive as that particular film is, it still provides windows of opportunity for conversation, and one of those is about Hemingway and race. There are lots of silences that need to be filled here, and I hope today's conversation will help fill the void just a little bit. To provide even more, just a little more context, we can just talk about some questions that are going to be answered. Carl alluded to this just a little bit ago. We're going to touch on things like how the Black Lives Matter will affect how we teach, think, write about Hemingway, talk about Hemingway in this moment. If it affects how we do all of those things, in what ways? I mean, Hemingway and race is a large and complicated topic, as Carl suggested, over the last couple of decades. Hemingway's engagement with the Latin community and with the Native American community is been well spoken of. But this panel is going to focus primarily on Hemingway and his conversations with, or lack of conversations with, the Black community. Okay, so having said all of that, let's introduce our panelists here. And just to be equitable, we're going to do this in alphabetical order, because what I'm seeing here are a bunch of Brady Bunch windows. First of all, let me introduce Gary Holcomb. He's a professor of African American literature and studies at Ohio University, as well as co-editing Harlem Renaissance author Claude McKay's circa 1933 recently discovered novel, Romance in Marseille, out through Penguin Press just last year. He's also the editor of Teaching Hemingway and Race, out through Kent State University Press, out a couple of years ago, 2018. And with Charles Scruggs, he's the co-editor of Hemingway and the Black Renaissance, also through Ohio State University Press, out in 2012. Welcome, Gary. It's been a while since I've seen you. Next up, we've got Ian Marshall. Ian is the Associate Dean and Professor of English in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the William Patterson University of New Jersey. And he specializes in cultural rhetoric, modern American literature, and rhetoric and composition. Welcome, Ian. Quentin Miller is Professor and Chair of English at Suffolk University in Boston, where he teaches courses on American literature, African American literature, and fiction writing. He is also the author and editor or co-editor of a dozen books, most recently James Baldwin in Context 2019, and the Bedford Compact Introduction to Literature, out in 2020, just last year. Welcome, Quentin. And finally, we've got Peggy Wright Cleveland, who comes to us from Florida State University. Her most recent essay thinks through connections between Hemingway's prose, construction of whiteness, and Edward Said's ideas on colonialism. She first published in Gary Holcomb's edited volume, Hemingway and the Black Renaissance, and since has contributed essays to Teaching Hemingway and Modernism and Teaching Hemingway and Race. Welcome, Peggy. And just to provide a little show and tell visual, all of us are featured in both of these wonderful collections on Hemingway and Race out in the last few years. Welcome, everybody. I thought we would start, there are plenty of things we can talk about, but I thought we would start with some broad questions and then maybe narrow the focus, add some nuance to the conversation as need be, and we'll see where the conversation goes. I thought at the very beginning, we might engage our conversation with just talking about the sort of uniqueness of the moment, all the things that are converging right now, all the things that are in the ether, topics that range from Black Lives Matter to white supremacy to critical race theory, something that's been bandied about a lot over the last few years. As a general question, and I've been asked iterations of this question over the last couple of months, so I think it's a valid place to start. In the moment of Black Lives Matter and discussions about white fragility and anti-racism, does Hemingway still matter? And maybe let me put this question slightly differently and suggest this, in this contemporary moment of all of the politics we've been talking about, politics of outrage, talk of cancellation and cancel culture, is Hemingway relevant and necessary? And I'll ask that of the panel generally, because it's a very broad question, but I've had plenty of people ask me, why Hemingway? Why talk about another dead white guy? All right, shall I choose somebody? How about we start with Peggy? You're smiling. Yeah, you've got your hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
I'll go first. We'll see how this turns out. I think part of this moment is that we have to interrogate whiteness. And I think Hemingway wrote and told us a lot about whiteness, particularly white masculinity, which is certainly a key player in the Black Lives Movement. It's a key cause of the violence that happens against Black men. And so I think, yes, he's probably more relevant now than maybe he's been at other moments in history, because it's important that white people in particular, and everyone, understand how whiteness works, how white supremacy works, where it's hiding. We need to lift the veil of its invisibility and its silence, which gives its power, and start to figure it out so that we can change it.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk more about that. I'm going to ask a little bit more about the idea of whiteness as power, inherent power in the text, the construction of whiteness. I'll ask you and maybe some others on the panel here. But more generally, again, anybody else want to chime in on this? Why Hemingway matters in this moment where we're talking about cancel culture? I mean, I've been asked very pointedly, why isn't Hemingway been canceled yet? And any number of texts could validate an argument as such. But I like to take a different stance, and I like to sort of add complication and nuance to the conversation. Anybody else want to chime in on this? Yeah, Quentin.
I saw Gary's hand up. Sorry, Gary. I'll just be brief about it. Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, obviously, and the notion of cancellation is troublesome in many ways, because just by kind of ignoring someone's contributions, you're maybe contributing to the problem a little bit, because it's a way of of not addressing something. It's a variation on what Peggy was saying so eloquently before. But I do think that there's a lot to be lost when one ignores or removes someone who's been very influential. And I think that influence is one way, not the only way, certainly, to think about Hemingway and Hemingway and African-American culture. His influence is well documented in Gary and Charles's book on authors like James Baldwin and Albert Murray, certainly, and Ralph Ellison. So if you kind of remove Hemingway from that equation, then it's a kind of domino effect. He becomes invisible, and I want to come back to that idea of invisibility later in a different context. But that's how I would add to what Peggy already said.
Yeah, and I like that idea of invisibility as well, and we'll be talking about that in a second. Gary, you wanted to chime in, and then I guess Ian.
Actually, I'd like to hear what Ian has to say too, probably before I speak too much. But I'm going to take up where Quentin, posed a couple of interesting points there. I think about Baldwin, for example. I mean, Baldwin, as we know, was ambivalent about Hemingway. There were some things about Hemingway that Baldwin was found useful as a professional, as a writer, you know. But, you know, he criticized Hemingway quite rightly. And in some ways, I think we can't really, I think it's a richer discussion, for example, to talk about Baldwin or Ellison and people like that, if we know something about Hemingway too, because that's the conversation that's taking place through the modernist period, you know, the sort of, to use George Hutchinson's term, the Harlem Renaissance in black and white, you know, these things didn't, the problem I think of the past was when we talked about the lost generation or the sort of the high modernists and so on, we talked about them as if there was just one sort of, you know, historical sort of, you know, trajectory there, white male authors mainly. And I think that the possibility of, you know, if we're going to continue talking about Hemingway, if we're going to continue talking about Baldwin and Ellison, you know, I think we have to keep in mind that there was a rich conversation, much of it not in total agreement, that was going on between black and white writers throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, you know. Just one more thing, Toni Morrison, of course, we know her for criticizing Hemingway in Playing in the Dark, but she also wrote essays where she talked about her admiration for aspects of what Hemingway was doing. So it's a complex, you know, history. So I would cede now to Ian.
Yeah, I think it really is pretty complex. Just to pick up on a couple of points that I guess each of you have made. You know, if we're going to cancel Hemingway, my guess is that it has something to do not so much with what he was actually doing, but with the way that he's presented often in you know, images of Hemingway as a particular figure, right? So it's not necessarily his work. It may not even be his criticism or the criticism of his work. And it may not be him at all. It may be the image that's been projected about him that people are interested in thinking about canceling, right? And, you know, just thinking about the two books that you presented, Mark, that obviously Gary had a lot to do with, and we're all in there in one way or another. If it's important to think about how Hemingway influenced folk like Jimmy Baldwin and Hughes and so on and so forth, it's equally important, I think, to think about how they influenced him and how they had, you know, an important influence on American literature. And the issue for me at this point isn't whether or not Hemingway is going to go away. I just don't think that that's not in the cards right now, as far as I can see. I think the perennial problem is that, you know, Black folk just don't show up in American lit in the ways that we need them to show up, both as authors and as serious, you know, participants in a tradition of literary criticism.
Yeah, let me dovetail with that just a little bit, or piggyback on that idea. Just more generally, you know, widely speaking, you know, I mean, I can remember, and I'm sure others can suggest the same thing. You know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I can remember even being in high school and there being debates about Mark Twain, you know, and Huckleberry Finn being taught. Those conversations are perennial conversations; they're ongoing. But what I would say is, you know, Gary, you brought up Morrison's Playing in the Dark, and that's always that's the perennial go-to for all of us here. She's even when she says something that some of us might find problematic, and I do find, you know, the outright indictments kind of problematic, because I think there's, not to be a Hemingway apologist or defender, but I think it's more complicated than that. But she suggests, and I'm getting the language maybe a little gnarled here, but she suggests that the dream tells us as much about the dream itself, tells us as much about the dream itself as it does about the dreamer, who's dreaming the dream. You know, and so our conversations about Hemingway, even if he's not actually having Black folks show up, as you say, Ian, it tells us something about him, it tells us something about those times, and it tells us something about ourselves. And these conversations tell us something about ourselves, the fact that they're still ongoing in 20 years into the 21st century. You know, they talk of cancellation culture or whatnot. And should Huckleberry Finn be taught? Should the battle to be taught in class? I mean, those are questions that I'm still sort of marveling at that we're still talking about. Anybody else want to chime in on this question? I mean, it's an all-encompassing kind of questions, but I think it also is a fair question and a fair place to start, because those are the kind of questions that I get, and I'm sure some of you get in the classroom. Why are we studying this now? You know, why, as you say, Ian, you know, if the epithets are hurled left and right, why are we studying this guy? Because it tells us something important about ourselves, I think. But anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, Gary.
Can I just briefly reinforce what Ian was saying about the importance of African-American writers, Black writers on, and not just also African writers, René Marin, for example, on Hemingway's writing. I mean, Peggy has written about this question of, you know, where's the connection, what kind of connection may exist between Jean Toomer's 1923 book, Cain, which was a revolutionary Harlem Renaissance text, a modernist text, and Hemingway's 1925 In Our Time. And I would go back to something, though, as well, that's going on around the same time, and that's Sherwood Anderson's Dark Laughter, 1925, I think. Sherwood Anderson loved Cain. He told Gertrude Stein that she should read it. Gertrude Stein was Hemingway's mentor at the time, the 1920s, the Lost Generation period in Paris. And then, you know, so then Hemingway comes along and he writes this horrible, and horrible on so many dimensions, satire of Dark Laughter. I mean, the thing that happens is Sherwood Anderson writes about Black people. It's a kind of like a Carl Van Vechten, you know, N-word heaven type text. Okay, if anybody's read Dark Laughter, I read it once. That was, I think, enough, you know. And then, so I would say Hemingway was somewhat justified in satirizing it. However, the satire was worse. And then, you know, the point I want to make is that Hemingway took this book, Dark Laughter, where Sherwood Anderson tried to write about Black characters unsuccessfully, I think it's fair to say. But Hemingway writes a satire where he writes about indigenous characters, right? Yeah. So he transforms it into this whole other kind of situation. I think partly because he probably was just more familiar with Native American people and felt less comfortable writing about Black characters. But my point really is that Hemingway certainly was influenced and affected by what was going on in the Harlem Renaissance and what was going on in French African writing, René Marin and so on. So yeah, it's not a one-way street. This is not a matter of Hemingway either influencing Baldwin or Ellison and people like that, and then having no, you know, he himself being sort of this, I don't know, genius character who's not affected by anyone.
Yeah, that's good. And I actually want to come back to, I'd like to maybe stop there and come back to that, revisit some of that, because I was going to ask about that, the sort of reciprocal nature crossing the color line. And I want to say a little bit more about that maybe in just a couple of minutes here. But I want to come back to that larger question again about cancellation and all of this other stuff, and ask you, you know, maybe briefly, has any of the events of the last few years, couple of years in particular, caused you to pause and maybe rethink how you teach Hemingway? And maybe this is two questions: how you approach Hemingway in your own scholarship? Has anything changed, for good or for bad? But maybe also, has anything changed in terms of how you present Hemingway in the classroom? Or have you had an opportunity yet? So maybe that's a twofold question here. Anybody want to take that question? Yeah, how about that, Quentin?
I'll get started. Maybe sidestepping your question just a little bit, but thinking through. One of the things that I've noticed that you just kind of have to be aware of now is students' sensitivity. You know, sometimes on their own behalf, sometimes on the behalf of everybody. So that there's a kind of awareness, a hyper awareness of things that I would not have been. That I wouldn't necessarily have addressed the same way before this historical moment. And I'm thinking of the use of the N-word that, you know, in The Sun Also Rises, for instance, there are two African-American characters, both of whom kind of fulfill stereotypes, right? One is the one that Bill Gordon is talking about, narrating about, who's a boxer. So the stereotype of African Americans as athletes, and the other is this drummer that Jake is describing in a club one night. And he's described as being all teeth and lips, so the stereotype goes even further. And then both of them are referred to gratuitously using the N-word both times. And in teaching the text before, I've just kind of never dealt with those characters. And I think I will have to now. I don't think it will be possible not to. Students will independently arrive at their own judgments about Hemingway as being a racist or having a racial blind spot or something. But the use of that word in particular, which maybe connects to Huck Finn, which Gary brought up before, right? And which, Jim is referred to that way throughout the text. But in Hemingway, these characters are so marginal and yet very present now. And I think that it would be impossible for me to approach the text without dealing with that question vis-a-vis that representation, which is very slight, but for students, I think will be glaringly evident. So I think that the next time I do teach The Sun Also Rises, it will be something that I'll take on, head on so that we can have a conversation about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because, part of my conversation, I'll just say this quickly and I'll go to Ian. Part of my conversations often start with, in the classroom, start with this idea of racial coding, right? There's a whole lot of that in several Hemingway texts, and that's a big one there. Ian, you had something you want to suggest.
Only very quickly. It is interesting because it really doesn't matter what I teach. The question of race, and at some point I would like to make a distinction between race, which I think many of us have sort of seen as this moving, unstable thing, and racism, which is very material. And you can actually point to it, it's data driven and so on and so forth. And I don't want to confuse those two things. And at some point, we should really articulate what we mean when we actually say the word race and what we mean when we say racism. When I walk into a classroom, it is preemptively raced. And that means that it doesn't, I could be teaching Wordsworth's Daffodils in a survey course. That is going to be tinged in ways that just goes beyond my control. So teaching The Sun Also Rises presents a problem because in some ways that is me metonomically, right? And there's nothing I can do about that, right? So I want to present that more as a question / problem than as an answer or a solution. It just situates the text and the teacher and the students in ways that I just think are really complex.
Yeah, and I want to stick with this question, but I think it also it begs another question. You just unfolded another question, which is, and this is also the perennial questions for students, and that is, can we call Hemingway racist? The students see the N-word or they see the metonymy that you're talking about, Ian, and they automatically go to that space. Can we go there for a second? Again, and all of these questions we can come back to because I feel that like there's a fluidity here and a constant sort of exchange. But can we go there for a second? I'm sure you've heard it yourself in the classroom. Is it fair to call Hemingway racist? Because he is a part of that systemic element you're talking about, Ian. Or is that a bombshell we want to maybe think about and stick with the conversation about classroom? We can. The greater question was how do you handle things in your scholarship or in the classroom? Has anything changed? But if you want, we can talk about the R word here. Yeah, Gary.
There's no question that he was a racist if you read his letters.
Oh yeah.
There's no reason to apologize in any way. But I think that, there's no but to that. But what I would say is that the point I was making earlier, or trying to make earlier, just a minute ago, was that to teach, first of all, to teach Hemingway and not to teach Hemingway through the prism or lens of race is an incomplete, I think, approach, because race, as Morrison says, it's always present in the text by, if nothing else, its absence, she says, its metaphysical absence, right? But also the point about Hemingway holding conversations with other Black writers, holding conversations about race in his texts, those things are there. And so I think that, yeah, I think that I would say to start with the point that he was a racist, you know, I think that's a valid beginning point. I'm going to let Peggy.
Peggy, come on in.
I'll take a slightly more controversial point and point of view, and I'll lead with saying that I believe all white people are trained to be racist. And I actually don't care if Hemingway was personally racist or not, because I work real hard in class and in my scholarship to separate the text into the cultural moment. And that's only because that's all we have. We have the text. We don't have Hemingway here, his intentions. There are pieces you can put together, certainly, and Gary mentioned his letters. But for the good I could get out of it, I talk about the text itself and try to get students in particular to not just talk about the author, but talk about the characters, what's happening here, how the characters may be exhibiting racist actions. That's fine. If you see that, let's talk about that. And that is certainly apparent. How they might be resisting the pressure to succumb to racist actions. But I do try to keep it unassigned to Hemingway just because I think it's more complicated than I want to delve into in class.
But often students will force your hand, and I think that's the fun challenge. Yeah, to Gary's point, I mean, there are, you know, several letters that kind of demonstrate just how racist Hemingway was in private conversation. But I often like to complicate that a little bit, because I always see Hemingway in performative mode. You know, how much of this is just that sort of BS bravado, trying to impress his friends? You know, there are a couple of letters where he's using the N-words pretty profusely in conversational company with Dos Passos. But how much of that is sort of this, you know, faux machismo, trying to sort of put on what I call sort of the expectation of celebrity in that moment. You know, he's an extension of white masculinity in that moment, and he's got to always be on. So I don't know, it's complicated, but he is a part of that oppressive system that you were talking about, Ian, just by engaging in that way. Let me complicate it a little bit more, if I can, and ask this as a sort of tertiary question, and that is, could we call him white supremacist? I mean, this is something we're talking about now almost every day in the headlines. I'm looking at headlines every day to make sure the world's still standing, and I see a headline that says something about white supremacy. I mean, his childhood hero was Teddy Roosevelt, who was super progressive when it came to environmental issues, although that's complicated with him standing in front of, you know, a lion or an elephant, you know, made dead. But at the same time, regressive when it came to matters of race, white supremacist. But again, the bigger question was, I guess, guys, has your thinking changed in the classroom? But Peggy, you had your hand up. White supremacist.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a real rich discussion to have, because it helps us to talk about white supremacy as more than putting on hoods and doing actual physical violence to people, right? And Hemingway grew up in a culture where very progressive, you might call them liberal whites, did positive things for their Black neighbors, but they did believe they were in charge and they were responsible for fixing things for their Black neighbors. And that's a piece of white supremacy. So I think that's a rich conversation to have once we get past, we can't prove he marched around in a hood.
Yeah, and to your point, and to your own scholarship, you know, that Oak Park was at the center of all of this. It's sort of the crossroads, progressive thinking, Chicago right down the road, but at the same time, regressive thinking at the center of eugenicist conversations. Anybody else want to take up this question or a leg of it? Well, we can simplify and come back to the idea of, has your thinking changed at all? Yeah, Ian.
Only very quickly, I just want to underscore what Peggy's just said. I think the 2 points that she made are really interesting. A, that all white people are trained to be racist, and by definition, that means that Hemingway would be. But that's not an especially interesting question. I think the interesting question is, what are you able to do with his literature? What are you able to expose with it? And that second question, I'm not sure there's, well, let me say that, well, I'm not sure there's much doubt that this is a wholly racial, to use Morrison's own words, a wholly racialized society, and by definition, a white supremacist society. And in an odd way, it comes back to this issue of cancel culture, and why isn't Hemingway canceled, and so on, and why are certain things up for that term of shall we cancel X or Y? It's because the people who are in power, I think, are able to dictate the terms. They're able to shape the rhetoric. Black Lives Matter becomes problematic only because, right, the folks who have the levers of cultural rhetoric are able to pull them. Black Lives Matter is a lot older than last year or the pandemic, but it's only in the context of the pandemic that we're beginning to question these things. I think the same is true for critical race theory, which is stunning in its ability to sort of get resurrected. Actually, they dug deep to find that one. And I'm talking about the ruling class, and that's another issue that we're yet to talk about. I think that the nature of social class conflict vis-a-vis Ernest Hemingway, which I think is an important conversation to have, but I realize we may not be able to get to that.
We'll see. Anybody else? Quentin, did you want to chime in on this?
I wanted to add a little something to this very good conversation, and it just in my thinking, it would be hard to kind of label Hemingway or to get to that point with our students without enough context, but I think what becomes evident, this goes back to a point that I think Ian was making before, is that we have evidence just by reading Hemingway's texts, not necessarily that he was a racist, white supremacist, this depends on definition, but that he certainly did not present or create, fully formed, rounded African-American characters. That I want to go back to that idea of invisibility that I brought up before. Even in those two examples that I brought up from The Sun Also Rises, in the second one, and I'm sure people remember this, the character's speech is reduced to ellipses. Like at first he's just singing, and then there's just these weird, spaces, like he's saying or singing something, but we don't know what it is. And I think it's possible, I think it's likely that everybody who's listening to this panel right now who teaches Hemingway introduces the Iceberg Theory at some point, right? There's always this idea that Hemingway's principle of omission is one that explains his aesthetic. And I think it could be concluded, some students could conclude that this is an example of that there's a character who's sort of, just slightly visible, but there's something else going on with that character under the surface, including in his speech, that we don't see. The question for me is whether that kind of gives Hemingway cover or something like that, that there's a sort of, you can almost use the Iceberg Theory as an excuse, or you can almost equate omission with invisibility in ways that I don't think are productive enough. I think there's a deeper conversation to be had around that. So I think it is a moment to be scrutinized, even to ask students what's going on with those ellipses. Why isn't this character allowed to speak? And then I don't think we necessarily can get to the conclusion that Hemingway was a racist, but we can understand that what he's doing in representing his African-American characters is incomplete.
Yeah, anybody else? Yeah, Gary?
I think one thing we underestimate about Hemingway is his capacity for satire. And this really complicates things so much, I think. I was going back to his satire of of Sherwood Anderson's Dark Laughter. You know, he starts in satire. The Sun Also Rises is satirical. It's a roman à clef. You know, he's making fun of his best friends. You know, people wouldn't even speak to him after he wrote that book. You know, about them, and then in the original drafts, he used their actual names, and he changes their names later and things like that. I was thinking about the other Black character in The Sun Also Rises as well, who's satirized. He's the prize fighter. He's as admirable as the bullfighter toward the later part of the novel, Pedro Romero. He's not given a name that I can recall, the Black prize fighter.
No.
And all of his entire narrative is told through Bill Gorton's, week or two long drunken binge rhetoric. And I was thinking, he never actually speaks for himself. On some level, I think, whether it's fair of Hemingway or not to do that, on one level, he is satirizing something. He's satirizing I think he's satirizing the Harlem Renaissance. I think he's satirizing the new Negro identity. I think he's satirizing the sort of earnestness, if you will, of cultural change that's taking place. At the same time, he's trying to insert this kind of realism into the text. It's interesting what he's doing. I think that I find his satirical writing the most interesting because I think it's the most complex. The Sun Also Rises. If we don't teach The Sun Also Rises, I think that we're missing out on something really important.
Yeah, and I'd like to add one thing too, and pair that with your ideas here about satire, Gary. And I would say that just as immersed as he is in what I would call really dark humor and the satire, I would add, he's mired in tragedy. Everything that he writes is mired in tragedy. So he may be satirizing the ethos of the Harlem Renaissance in that moment, but that boxer that we're talking about featured in, for maybe a page or so worth of storytelling on the part of Bill Gorton in The Sun Also Rises. The one thing, he doesn't speak for himself. He doesn't have a name, but the one thing we know, the one reference that's made here is Hemingway's boxing references to Tiger Flowers. And Tiger Flowers is one of these forgotten figures whose life is also mired in tragedy. I would suggest that the complication also starts there. That so much, I asked my question, and maybe this question can be our next one to kind of get us to the next point of the overarching conversation, which is, did Black or brown lives matter to Hemingway? And I think they did. I think he was at times somewhat inept or incapable of quite getting to the place where we want him to go. Does he fully flesh out characters as is the indictment of somebody like Morrison? No, we can all agree on that. But I think imbued in a character like the one we're just describing here, the nameless boxer, or a story that I wrote about years ago that I think is wonderful, The Fragment, The Porter, which was supposed to be a part of a bigger novel that Hemingway ditched so he could write, A Farewell to Arms. The Porter, that story is just dripping with tragedy. The Native American figures that we talk about that are often nameless, that are featured in, that are parodied in something like Torrents of Spring, as clunky as that book is, I think that there's also some imbued tragedy in those narratives. So, it's imperfect, certainly, but I think that Hemingway, sort of to answer my own question here, to me, Black lives did matter. I think he was just not always the best in articulating just how much. And that's where I start in the classroom. I say to somebody, why are we studying Hemingway through the lens of race? If it didn't matter, why is race so heavily on his mind? Even in a story like The Battler, which is something that I go to, and a story that's featured in my own criticism in your collection, Gary. It's the preeminent question I have is, if he didn't care, and if it stops with the epithet, then why is Bugs the protagonist and the real hero, if you want to call him that, of the story? I think because he does, those Black lives do matter. Anybody else?
Just really quick. So, taking as a first principle, Black lives mattered to Hemingway. Is it possible to discern whether or not Hemingway believed that Black lives mattered to themselves? And it sounds like an odd question, but it just I think it's an interesting way of maybe just getting at the question of equity, of humanism, of humanity, from a slightly different point of view, because there are things that just come to mind that that just makes me wonder, right? Take the Porter, for example. My reading of that text demands that we read it next to Benito Cereno.
Mhm.
And, Babo in Benito Cereno does very different things with that knife than, the surrogate father in Hemingway. And I think that a couple of things are happening there. One is, I think he had an extraordinarily difficult time rendering Black characters, as Quentin pointed out before. I think the second thing that's going on is that's part of a culture, and it may well be connected on a perhaps deeper level to just what we might coarsely call working class culture, that he just didn't have much access to, try as he might. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, let me add one thing to that. You just sparked a thought in my mind too, and that is, and this is also dovetailing with something that Gary mentioned earlier, because Gary, you mentioned The Torch of Spring, which I love because it's such a bad book, and it does all those things you suggest, and it does a lot of things at one time. And what is it, like 90 pages or something like that. But Ian, you were talking about this being sort of, reading Hemingway through the lens of something like class. Maybe not necessarily directly linked to this is my question, and that is Hemingway just as guilty of romancing race as he accused Sherwood Anderson of doing? And I don't necessarily think so, but I mean, it's, as we've proven so far, this entire subject is very complicated. Anybody have a thought on that? Does Hemingway romance race? Take a look at any number of his renderings of Native peoples, or think about, come back to the Sun Also Rises, where he has such an affinity for the afición, the authentic Spanish people. What does that mean? Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, again, the nameless N-word prize fighter in The Sun Also Rises is as admirable as Pedro Romero.
Right.
There's that. And the Battler, Bugs, is admirable. Why is he identified with the N-word? Is there some weird, is Hemingway working against the reader's, expectations, or what the reader wants, or something, using that word in that story? Or Sam the cook in The Killers, who is, sort of the traditional reading is that Sam the cook is cowardly, because he doesn't want to help the Swede. But Sam says to Nick, he says, little boys think they know everything. I think that's a direct quote, something pretty close to that. What he's saying, Sam is coming from the perspective of being a Black man in the early part of the 20th century, right? And Nick can't hear what he says because Nick is a white boy. He has that privilege that he cannot hear what Sam is saying. So I think it depends on the text. It depends on the context. But I do think that he idealizes Africans in
absolutely,
in his safari texts and so forth. So that is, again, it's a complex question, and I'm tending to think it really depends on the text itself generally.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add, something that Peggy said earlier when she was alluding to, Oak Park being this complex space. It is, and Hemingway's a direct extension of that complexity. I think you're right, Gary. I think it depends on the text, depends on the moment, depends who's in the audience in that moment. It's complicated. Bugs is, heroic and admirable in something like The Battler, but, he is described using that metonymy that Ian talked about, and that racial coding. Morrison would call it a cheat in Playing in the Dark. She says it's basically Hemingway being lazy. And I don't think that's so. I think Hemingway's the master of that sort of evocative language and the imagism of the art of that moment. And he knows that that word has all the baggage in the world that comes along with it. The N word does. And to your point, Gary, this has always been my contention, racist as he may be in particular moments and being a part of that extension of that white audience that you suggest, Peggy, is always going to be trained to be sort of racist. I think that he's working out those complications with each of his works, and he's trying to sort of reconcile, the divide between what he personally knows to be true and the history which he knew well of, say, the native people of the regions that he visited every summer, in Walloon Lake or whatnot, and what he hears in this, pseudoscience of the moment at these eugenicist conferences, and what's in the newspaper, and what his audience expects. Yes, what a middle-aged white man would want to see or read at a particular moment when he's reading, The Battler. But he complicates it because the white former prize fighter in that story is not heroic. He's anything but. Why does Hemingway do that? I think it's complicated. Yeah, Peggy.
I think as we contextualize the stories and the time periods, you have to realize that Hemingway really had no models for seeing race any differently. And so it's not an excuse for him. I think he really could not imagine so far out, right? And he would push against it. And I think there were things that felt wrong to him. And then, of course, he saw in culture, because he was a keen observer. He saw in culture when people were punished for whatever behaviors they were exhibiting racist, or if you were not being racist enough and you got punished for that. But he never could figure out a solution to the problem. And he didn't even, I think, attempt to imagine that. But I do think he recorded the problem whenever he noticed it.
And one thing I'll add to that, and again, I'm just having thoughts. This conversation is so great. I'm having thoughts as each of you sort of bring something different to this portion of the conversation. I'm also thinking about the part that violence plays in keeping that, to your points earlier, Ian, that social order in place. Can we talk some about critical race theory? And can we talk some, I'm looking at the clock and I see that we're running short on time seemingly, but we haven't even talked about, the construction of whiteness. But before we do any of that, maybe just for another minute, we can come back to something that you alluded to, Gary, and something that you alluded to, Quentin. Certainly you allude to, and you talk extensively about in your own writing, and that is the influence of Black writers on Hemingway and vice versa. Can we say anything more about that hasn't been said? Under this large umbrella of, do Black lives matter or brown lives matter to Hemingway? The influence of some of these writers and his influence on them. I know, Quentin, you've done some work with Baldwin and Hemingway as two expatriates at different moments, and the convergence of their ideals. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say because the writer I'm about to mention is one that not as many people have read that much, and that's Albert Murray, who was a kind of a very unique writer, a cultural critic. Really spoke about Hemingway as a blues artist. And I think that in order to really deepen the conversation, if you want to get at the question from another angle, I would just refer everyone to Albert Murray, to the hero in the blues, and to think about the way he was reading Hemingway. This goes back to the tragedy that Gary alluded to before, but I'll just throw that name out there and let people explore Albert Murray if they haven't already.
Yeah, Ellison has talked extensively, as you all know, also about the blues sort of permeating Hemingway's ethos. Gary, you want to add anything else before we leave this alone as well? The influence of the Harlem Renaissance or Black figures?
Langston Hughes basically seems to have taken up the idea of writing short stories, and I think he's a fantastic short story writer myself, and moving away so much from only doing poetry and drama. Not so much influenced solely by Hemingway, but certainly Hemingway is a big influence on his moving toward doing that. Of course, Claude McCabe, who I've written about extensively, this is where I started with my interest in Black writers and their response to Hemingway. He said The Sun Also Rises in Our Time had enormous impact on it, even though he said my own writing is quite different than that, But I think, does Suzanne want to move on to questions from people? I'm not sure. I'm looking at
Yes, I'm just sort of popping into the screen to say that we have a few questions in areas that we haven't touched on yet, or at least not in any detail. So I wanted to make sure we had a moment, but I hated to interrupt that conversation. Thank you so much for all of the things you've been saying. So the one area that we haven't talked about a lot that came up twice in the chat is, and the questions, is about Hemingway's time in Africa, and particularly that second African safari where he attempted to, sort of tribalize himself and join the Wakanda tribe and have a relationship with a woman in that tribe, or a girl in that tribe, Deba. So just wondering about how that fits in, and questions of maybe racial appropriation, or what do we feel about that moment in terms of how he relates to racial others?
Well, just to get the ball rolling and to fill the silent void here really quickly, I'll simply say that, yeah, that's one of those moments where I say he is just as guilty as those he accuses of being, in terms of romanticizing a people. Even in the first safari, he's romanticizing the Maasai people and juxtaposing them with others who are part of his cohort, who come from different tribes. And that's complicated because he draws likenesses to the Romans when he talks about those people, and so we've got a whole different layer of complication there. And in that second trip, yeah, he for lack of a better term, goes native in trying to sort of become one of these people, and sees himself as being a brother, but that's highly problematic. Anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, Gary.
Just briefly, I mean, the overarching theme of Hemingway's writing is that Rousseauian turn away from civilization toward the primitive, primitivism, and of course he's projecting, modernist. He's a modern primitive or something, or a primitive modern. He's projecting, the idea of all that onto Africa, for lack of a better, more precise term, I think in this case. And so I think that, yeah, and this is the key to what he's doing, I think, going back to The Sun Also Rises, where you mentioned earlier, is he romanticizing or idealizing, the Basque peasants, of course he's, I'll start with just one point from Richard Wright. Richard Wright wrote a book called Pig in Spain, and he engages with Hemingway in this text about bullfighting. And Richard Wright says the bullfight is a lynching. Now that is a quite different perspective, I think, on lynching than I've seen in anything that in The Death in the Afternoon or any other writing about bullfighting. That the bull is being lynched is what Richard Wright's talking about. So I'll stop there with that. In other words, the engagement with Hemingway there is very critical, and and I think that Hemingway, I think he is projecting onto cultures this idea that that was just a central part of modernist belief.
Yeah, and an essential part of that is, to your point, Gary, again, sort of imbued and wrapped up in violence. And for Black people, that was a very stark reality. Langston Hughes would write about this, again, in that same moment. Violence meaning different things to these different communities. Anybody else? Yeah.
I would add about his work in Africa that what it teaches us about whiteness is this belief that a white person can change as he or she wants to, right? That we have this power and this choice. And sometimes the mistaken belief is that anyone can do that. But those late African texts have characters transgressing race and gender, right? Which is really progressive, interesting storytelling. But it is from a position of power that might actually be possible, right? It's not someone it's not a cultural identity that is controlled by others. It's controlled by the self. And that's, I think, an aspect of whiteness. And that's one of the things we can get out of those late stories.
Yeah, and that very same thing that you're speaking about, Peggy, privilege allows him to become a Wakamba member for a moment. And then it also allows him to go back to his cushy life afterwards.
Another set of questions in the chat have to do people grappling with this idea that Hemingway is racist, pointing out that, of course, he was raised over 100 years ago and that standards were different. And then somebody else mentioning, and I think it's the aura of judgment, obviously, that has people sometimes want to say, well, let's contextualize it, right? There's also another person commented, well, he wasn't sort of personally racist all the time because Gertrude Stein, who was Jewish, was the godmother of his first son, John. So how do we reconcile, and this is something you guys were getting into, these multi engagements with people of different race and different contexts and different audiences. And I'll end with this piece of it. Another member of the audience said maybe using the idea of being anti-racist is a helpful way into this conversation in this moment. So so around that question about historicizing, being a racist, and then this useful category I think that we've developed in recent years more profoundly of being actively anti-racist.
Does anybody want to take up that question?
Well, just briefly, it's just an idea it's kind of coalescing a little bit as we talk. So I don't know if it's going to come out very articulately, but there's a sense that I'm getting that Hemingway, sort of understood the importance of the racial other to his own mindset and approached it, but was also fearful, right? That there was a sense that he didn't want to get into, for instance, the psychology of his African-American characters, and he wanted to kind of keep them at a distance. He knew that they were sort of important for him to approach, but he was scared to go beneath the surface. So I do think that's another way to think about it, to say that, he kind of, it's kind of like his trips to Africa. Like, I want to do this, even though it might hold a little bit of fear for me, but I'm going to do it on my own terms. And I guess that line is where things get kind of interesting, and which differentiate, I think, him from some of his contemporaries, because I would hesitate to say that Hemingway was just a product of his time, because his time included the Harlem Renaissance. So that there's, and as we've said, he was aware of that. So I think that there's just a kind of trepidation there that I'm coming to terms with as we're all talking through this.
Yeah, Ian?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Quentin's saying there. I'm sort of compelled to look at it from the point of view of those being affected from a certain point of view, right? And my issue is, like, at the end of the day, right, the African-American community is comprised of human beings. And I'm not sure you need to go into the question of, well, was he always racist, right? That third question is much more compelling to me. At what points was he actually actively anti-racist, and how can you see that in his text, right? Or where do you see that in his text? Because if we're talking about Hemingway as being one of the great writers of the 20th century, not just in the US, but globally, I know people in the Caribbean and in the UK who grew up on, Old Man and the Sea, right?
Mm-hmm.
You talk, so this is an internationally renowned figure, but yet he's not capable of representing humanity in its, right, in that sort of global way. So, so that question, that tripartite question, is complicated, I think, as I guess as all of these questions are, but it just creates, like, great that we're looking at it as from Hemingway's point of view, but at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
there are human beings, there are literally lives that are at stake, and how we package a figure as important as Ernest Hemingway as aficionados and as scholars of Hemingway and as people interested in literature is really important. So yeah.
That sort of begs the question here. I think that's a great series of questions you raise here. Would we feel differently? How would we feel if Hemingway took a more active role, say both in his active politics and his reporting? I mean, he wrote a well-known piece on representing the status of vets. What if he took a more active role and tried to sort of take the charge of the Black community, but maybe more appropriate to your points, Ian, what if he took on the mantle of a Black person the way Baldwin does in something like Giovanni's Room, taking on the vestiges of a white person? Would the conversation be any different? Or would we still be talking about a white person racially appropriating another community? Does that question make any sense?
I'd only say I'm not sure that he would actually need to do that, because there are, with his creative powers, and there are folks out there who don't have to take on the mantle of becoming in order to present the realities that you see. He said, write what you know, right?
Yeah, right.
so does write what you know simultaneously mean write what you actually see? One of the things that strikes me about the Black Lives Matter movement is that the advent of the iPhone was key to it being a thing. What did Hemingway see? And not just in newspapers and so on and so forth, but what did he see when he actually walked out on the street and he saw life in America in his time walking down Main Street? And why couldn't he just depict that?
Yeah, fair question. Anybody else?
I'd say that's where the question of the distortion of racism comes in, and we're talking about violence, the violence of language. Even that N-word that we've been talking about off and on throughout the conversation. This was Hemingway's way of kind of keeping people at a distance, of not risking seeing them as fully human in a way. And again, I'm thinking about his fearfulness, his trepidation. Of understanding. There was a quotation from your book, Gary, if I may, from the introduction, in which that word in particular, you suggest that it represents the white man's feeble attempt to label what he cannot understand. And I think it's that lack of understanding that makes, that frustrates us in some ways, looking back, because we do know, as Ian said, what he was capable of creatively. And I think we're also becoming aware of what he wasn't capable of. And there's, again, that little bit of a gulf that's worth examining.
Yeah, so much of our conversation, I think, is sort of encircling this idea of the attempt, right? This is what he's attempting to do. And again, I want to come back to the porter, which for me kind of speaks really very broadly, but also very specifically to all the things that we've talked about today. There's a great, I'm not sure there's a great portion of dialogue. I'm not sure what the exact lines are, but you've got the feature porter, George, that says at one point something like, he says a couple of things. He says, everybody needs a point of view, and he talks about sharing a point of view and calls some of his other porters in arms his kindred spirits. And in that story, I feel more so than anything else that I've read in a while, that sense of the blues that we've talked about. I don't know if it was you, Quentin, or Gary, one of you suggested that. And I think it's all in that attempt to kind of take on the skin of an African-American for a moment. And that's probably the closest we get. And for me, that's probably one of his more successful attempts. How much time have we got, Suzanne? I know we're
Okay,
running.
yeah, we're going to try to wrap it up at around 2:15 just to respect everyone's time. We have a question. I don't know if everybody is up to tackle this, but it struck me as an interesting one about Faulkner, who's another great modernist writer with complicated relationship to race, and Hemingway. Is the kind of struggle that we see in Faulkner around race the same or similar to the kind of struggle we see with Hemingway and race? Would you make distinctions between them in that way?
I'd say very quickly, I would just say yes to both questions. I think they're similar, but I also think they're different. I think that coming back to Ian's point about the failed attempts, I think that Faulkner comes closer because he lived amongst these people, as you say, Ian, that he would see on the streets, whereas Hemingway didn't necessarily have those experiences. And that limits his artistry in that sense.
Yeah, I'd second that and say that there was just more of an urgency for Faulkner to deal with it. With Hemingway, it seems that he had many other concerns. For Faulkner, I think that this was really at the heart of his concerns, and he approached it slightly differently. But it's an interesting comparison, and I think if we're refocusing on the classroom, this would be something to present there too for students to with as much context as we could possibly provide for students to wrestle with.
Yeah, Peggy?
I also think Faulkner was actually more interested in true social change and more invested in that than Hemingway's prose tells us he was or would admit to being. So there's that different, Faulkner had, lived experience that the problem needed to be fixed. And we don't get that urgency in Hemingway.
Yeah, Gary.
I don't want to stop talking about Faulkner and Hemingway, but there's another writer I think who's an important part of this discussion. That's John Dos Passos. And I think that we think about, on one level, The Sun Also Rises also being a response to Manhattan Transfer.
Yeah.
And the Black character in Manhattan Transfer, Jake the anarchist, who speaks very directly throughout Dos Passos text, I think what Hemingway wanted to do was turn away from what he regarded as sort of, first of all, he turned away from regionalism toward modernism. And then he also turned away from, I think he was ambivalent about texts that he thought right or wrong, that is, he was right or wrong, that had messages in them. I think he didn't want to, I think Faulkner is not a big writer on messages either necessarily, but he certainly is talking much more directly in his best fiction about the relationship between black and white. And I think it's much more successful, frankly.
Yeah, Hemingway's one very grandiose attempt at social messaging comes into Have and Have Not, and we can call that a failure all day long. But it's a book I love because it's complicated and it's something we haven't mentioned. And in that book, he's an equal opportunity offender to every community you can imagine, whether we're talking about women or Latinx people or Black people. Yeah, Gary.
I think To Have and Have Not's a fantastic novel.
Isn't it?
I read it recently while I was visiting Key West. Maybe you have to go to Key West and read it there. I don't know. But no, I think it's a fantastic novel. And I think that the problem with that novel is that William Faulkner wrote a screenplay where he set it in Martinique. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I'm just kind of half joking.
And maybe a joke after all the serious places we've been today, all the very productive places we've been is a really good thing. I'm going to hand it off to Carl, but before I do, he's going to do this too. But I just want to thank you all for your time, your insights. It's been a wonderful discussion. Carl?
Yeah, yes, thanks indeed. I mean, thanks, Mark, thanks, Ian, Gary, and Quentin, and Peggy. I mean, really, it's been a terrific discussion and really, truly thought-provoking in a way that hopefully will get us all to think about these issues more deeply in more complex ways, as readers and as teachers. And I look forward to seeing this pay off in future scholarship too, as we continue this discussion. So thank you so much for being here. Again, Suzanne and the media committee, thanks so much for organizing this event. And I look forward to seeing you all back here. I hope all of our attendees will join us again next Friday at 1 o'clock for Hemingway and Sex, in the age of Me Too, and seeing how that will advance, again, a long-standing conversation in the field, but one that I think we can rethink through this particularly, timely moment in recent events. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.